Okay, yeah, I record on my end then. Perfect.
Okay, so a lot of people are not aware of what federalization is all about. It seems it might be a niche topic, and hopefully we can shed some light on what the Federalist proposal is. So what's the problem with the current United Nations system? Because that's the first question. That's the first question that people will ask you. Why do we need to create something else while we already have United Nations? So what is the problem with the United Nations that gives us the impetus to reform it or create another system?
Yeah, well, generally there's a long list of problems, I would say, with the current United Nations. Perhaps the biggest, in my opinion, would be the democratic deficit. So the fact that the UN has a lot of mandate or authority over a lot of different issues, especially like war and peace. Like the UN can basically decide to send soldiers to places, things like that, or to bomb countries, but it's not a democratic organization. And also how the money is spent. So the UN has a massive budget, and there's no democratic accountability to how that money is spent. It's just decided by national governments and bureaucrats in Geneva and New York and other offices around the world, I know. So, I mean, generally they do a lot of really good work, but it does have a massive democratic deficit. And alongside that, I would say another massive issue would be the power asymmetry. So the permanent members of the Security Council, the P5, have basically an outsized amount of power, a disproportionate amount of power within the organization and within global affairs as a whole. So I believe that this power should be shared and distributed, not to countries of the world, not necessarily to nation states, but to humanity, to the people of the world. So I really believe in a united democracy of all humans. Yeah, and so that's, I think, yeah, so basically the outsized power, the asymmetric power, you could argue that that's sort of a holdover or a neo-colonial institution. I mean, Britain and France are relatively small countries today, and yet they have permanent seats on the Security Council. So you got to ask why, So it's just very interesting. So when the UN was founded, they promised that they would review the charter in 5 years' time, and that they would reform itself. The UN would reform itself in 5 years and perhaps become a democratic organization. That was what many people were told and believed about the United Nations when it was founded in the late 1940s, was that, yes, we'll start with this weird system we have now with the victorious powers in World War II having all of the, a disproportionate amount of power in global affairs, but eventually in 5 years, we'll all sit down and we'll craft a democratic and fair and equal organization to govern the globe. But that obviously never happened. So yeah, and there's a lot more issues, but I'll end there. But I should point out that the UN does do a lot of really good work. But you asked me what's wrong with the UN. So that was why I answered this way.
Yeah, I agree. Especially on the budget. There's a movie called Backstabbing for Beginners. It's a real story. Something that happened in I think it was Iraq during the beginning of the 21st century. I think the UN was okay. The UN placed a lot of sanctions on the Saddam Hussein regime, and all the profits from selling the Iraqi oil were managed by the United Nations. And the movie just shows how the UN mismanaged those funds, lining pockets of UN officials, including the son of Kofi Annan, and it was a big scandal that just put the UN in question about how democratic is it, how transparent is the United Nations. There's also the issue of war and peace, where the UN has failed in some cases, for example, in Rwanda, in Somalia, and at the same time, when it deploys its troops, then there's no accountability. It's not accountable to any government where these troops are deployed. So that's a very good response. And you've also mentioned the initial plan was to have a self-reforming United Nations. So how come that this has not happened after all these years?
Yeah, it's a good question. I really don't know. I mean, at a certain point, it's extremely obvious why it hasn't happened, because the victorious powers after World War II just wanted to keep their power, and this is largely led by the United States, which has a very outsized role when it comes to United Nations. But yeah, that's called the San Francisco Promise amongst sort of the community, amongst World Federalists and global citizens. So the UN was actually founded in San Francisco in 1945, in September 1945, I believe. That's when the charter was signed. They've never done anything else in San Francisco since that time, but that was when it was there, and the people, or the delegates from many countries were there, and they all signed the charter. And that was what basically the United States and the other permanent members of the Security Council told all the other countries was, oh, don't worry. We know that it looks really weird right now and that it's very asymmetrical and we have all the power, but we promise to review the charter in 5 years. And so it was documented. I think it was even written down, or it's even in the charter somewhere. I'm not so sure about that. I think Article 109 or something like that is like Article 109 of the UN Charter does say like we will review the charter, and it just never ever happened. Basically because the United States and the other victorious countries from the Second World War, they just didn't want to give up their permanent seat on the Security Council. So they would have to vote. The Security Council would have to vote to reform the charter. So they don't want to do that. So that's why it's never happened.
Okay. Well, while they don't have to lose their seats in the P5, can they encourage a more inclusive UNSC, for example, by including a few countries from, for example, South Asia, a few countries from Latin America, and a few countries from Africa, let's say Brazil, South Africa, and India, let's say.
Mm-hmm. I mean,
what are the challenges for that to happen?
Well, I guess so I just pulled it up, the article, and it says basically the charter can be reviewed if 2/3 of the General Assembly vote in favor of it, and then 9 members of the Security Council. And so since I think that there's like a total of 15 seats on the Security Council and 5 are permanent, I believe. So you would need a majority basically of the Security Council also to vote for it. So yeah, I don't really know. I mean, I know that they do have these like the other seats. So beyond the 5 permanent members, then you have these other 10 seats which do rotate amongst other countries of the world. I believe it's divided up by regions. So you have like, I don't know, 2 or 3 seats for like South America and 2 or 3 seats for Africa, things like that. So they sort of divide up the world into these regions and then give them each seats on the Security Council. And for those other countries, they have a seat for, I believe, 12 years. And And the permanent members, they call these rotating seats on the Security Council, they call these other countries tourists because they're only there for a short period of time relative to permanent members. And so I think that you might be able to get this charter review passed if you got enough. Basically, if you got 10 these tourists on the Security Council, they could vote for it. However, we must remember that not only are these permanent members of the Security Council also there permanently, they also have veto power. So even if 14 of the countries on the Security Council vote for charter review, just one of the P5 can hold it back and stop it. So it really just takes one country to stop the entire process. So that just shows you really how difficult it will be to go the charter review pathway. Now it's important to recognize that there are many other pathways to creating a world federation. I won't really get into all of them now, but this is just one. I don't really put all of my eggs in this basket. I don't think that this charter review process, like for me personally, is really going to happen anytime soon for the reasons that we've been talking about. The only way it will happen is if we have a mass movement of people around the world in all these countries, especially in the permanent members of the Security Council, pressing for charter review and pressing for change in global governance. I think that's what we really need to get any of this done.
Yeah, perfect. And so what other approaches can we use to create a united federation of nations?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few other ways to create a world federation would be, I mean, you have so what we've been talking about is UN reform, basically all at once. If we wrote a new charter, we could essentially call that a new constitution. It would be like creating a constitution for Earth, and it's very rapid. It's a very accelerated form of changing or transforming global governance. There's more incremental or slow forms of change here that do involve the UN. So this is things like what Liechtenstein actually just passed in the General Assembly. This happened just 2 or 3 weeks ago, but the General Assembly now passed a rule that every time the Security Council vetoes something, every time that one of the permanent members of the Security Council uses their veto power, the General Assembly will immediately meet to review that and to debate it. Which is great, I think, because it adds more, it addresses the power asymmetry. They can't really do anything about it, but they can at least, further the public debate over whether or not this is good, that these 5 countries can basically stop all global governance on an issue that if they want it, so I think that's really good. That's an incremental thing. Another one would be the We the People's Campaign. So that involves three policies. One is a World Citizens Initiative, which is essentially like a referendum or a petition from the people of the world. So basically, if a petition gets like a certain amount of votes, a few million or something, then it would force the General Assembly and perhaps the Security Council to review it. So really giving the public more of a say in global affairs. Another way would be the United Nations Parliamentary Assembly, or the UNPA. And this is more or less a slow process of turning the General Assembly into a world parliament, which we will celebrate actually this whole concept of a world parliament and a UNPA. We really draw attention to that with the Week for World Parliament in October. And then the third policy with the We the People's Campaign is the civil society envoy, which is basically a stronger position, a stronger office or voice for NGOs and for civil society within the organization. Yes, and that's all incremental UN change. So we've been really focused on the UN. However, it might be possible to create, a world federation without, alongside all of these UN changes. You know, it's not either or, but these can happen simultaneously. So other things like regional federations, like the European Union or the East African Federation or CARICOM or ECOWAS or ASEAN. I mean, there's so many. There's really a lot of these several regional organizations, and this whole regionalization process in which nation states decide to share their sovereignty with their neighbors and create supranational unions. That's great. And if that happens around the world, and it increases democracy and respect and protection of human rights and of the environment and all these things, if it achieves the goals that we're looking for as World Federalists, then I think it's great. And so, but to that end, you know, we support regionalization and we like to see more of it. And it could be that a series or a group of regions of the world could come together and form a World Federation somewhere down the line. And then alongside that, then you have the grassroots global democracy, which is basically much more connected to that, what I was talking about earlier, with many people around the world rising up in support of these ideas and you know, really calling for change and calling for humanity to have a voice in global affairs. So this is basically civil resistance and things like that. And forming, you know, maybe citizens' assemblies or somehow using technology to create a democracy online or something like that. I mean, there's a lot of different ideas there. This is really a big umbrella term, but there could be a sort of a grassroots global democracy that gets started. And then the nation states of the world or the UN would basically be forced to respect the decisions from this global democracy if it had, you know, most of the world's population participating in it. Yeah, so that's also quite difficult to achieve, but so is UN charter reform. So I think all of these are really quite difficult. It's an uphill battle. And then another one that I just remembered is the Union of Democracies, or basically democracies coming together. So this is very similar to the regional integration, but instead of a geographic focus, it's more of a political focus. So basically free liberal democracies to come together and form a union. What that looks like for the rest of the world, I have no idea. That's honestly my personal least favorite, because I see that as basically dividing the world, very similar to the way the world was divided in the 20th century with the Cold War. But it could be good, and it might be sort of a pathway of last resort should we need to solve global challenges very rapidly. Yeah, so those are sort of the key terms, but of course there's so much diversity. World Federalists love to debate and argue about these and have different ideas. So there's really a lot of diversity of ideas here.
Okay, cool. Now we can discuss the the approaches that you've mentioned, starting with the We the People's Campaign. We are looking to create a United Nations Parliamentary Assembly. And in your mind, how does that look like? Is it going to have universal suffrage where every citizen is going to be electing the members of parliament? Is it going to be appointments by the executive or the legislature? And how many seats are going to be allocated per country or per region? Is it going to be like the members of parliament, are they going to be elected on national, regional, or issue-based constituencies?
Yeah, that's really, those are really great questions. I would encourage anybody or you to, if you're interested, there's a really nice website called the UNPA campaign.org that has a lot of detailed information about all these questions. They have a really nice frequently asked questions as well. But more or less, it's a slow process. So the first step would be to create something called the United Nations Parliamentary Network, which would be a network of parliamentarians or MPs, representatives around the world, in national or even local level or subnational parliaments, basically voicing their support for this idea. And then they could basically come together in supranational institutions as well, like existing international parliamentary institutions like the European Parliament or the Pan-African Parliament. These could also offer their expertise. But basically, this whole idea of getting parliamentarians together to basically answer these questions that you have just set out. The whole question of allocation of seats is a very important question, and there's a diversity. There's a lot of different ideas about what it would look like. Should it be one country, one vote, or should it be like the UN like the GA sort of is right now, but without the veto power? Or should it be based on population or regions or political, or how much money they give to the UN? There's a lot of different ideas out there. I think the core thing here is that we need people that are elected by other people, basically. We need some sort of democratic legitimacy to this whole process. It's really nice for me to sit here and say, well, this is how I would reform the UN, but I'm not elected by anybody. I'm just a guy. So what we really need is for people that are elected by their constituents, by citizens in their countries and localities, to come together and actually answer these questions for themselves, because that decision that they make will have the democratic legitimacy that's necessary, that we're trying to give to the UN. So I know it's sort of a cop-out. I'm not really answering your question. I mean, I'm way more about the process here. My own personal utopia here would be probably based on population. I'm a really big fan of just one person, one vote, and keeping it very simple. But that's just me. World Federalists as a whole have a very different, I've argued with many people about that. Many of my good friends in the movement think that that's crazy. So that's just my personal opinion. So I hope I answered your question at least a little bit.
Yeah, and you've made the process clearer for me, that we're not going to start from scratch. We're actually going to use the parliamentarians that we have in our national or regional assemblies, and to build a momentum for the creation of this body. Do you know the legal requirements to create such a alternative body to the General Assembly? Is it going to be under the General Assembly? Is it going to be just like a committee under the General Assembly, or is it going to have its own mandate, its own budget, like a fully fledged World Parliament?
I mean, ideally it would. I know that the United or the General Assembly is able to create its own body, basically a sub body, and I know that that's one of the ways that it would happen, basically, or that it could happen. So if we got the General Assembly, you need, I believe, 15 countries to come together, and that's what's called a group of friends. That's the actual term in multilateralism. So you need a group of friends, which is 15 countries, and they come together and they can put something on the agenda for the General Assembly to basically debate and vote on. And so what we want these countries to put on the agenda would be, we should create a parliamentary assembly that is underneath the current General Assembly. So it would be subordinate to the current system. And the Parliamentary Assembly ideally would be fully democratic. We're talking about global democratic elections of some form and things like that. And having the equal weight, one person, one vote, and representatives, not just delegates, but actual people who are elected to represent a constituency, come together in this Parliamentary Assembly, which would be underneath the GA. But in theory, that Parliamentary Assembly would then have so much democratic legitimacy, because that's sort of how democracy works, is that people, it's an idea, and it's in people's minds. So when people see that they are represented in one body, but not represented in another, then they will automatically view the body that they are represented in as more important, basically. So the question of why does the GA, and especially why does the Security Council have so much power when we are voting for all of these people in the parliament and the Parliamentary Assembly? Why don't they have the power? And we see that discussion sort of coming out actually within the European Union, because for a long time, the European Parliament was extremely subordinate to the Council and the Commission. And for a long time, there have been this increasing sense of European citizenship and European citizens coming forward and saying, hey, why does the Parliament not have any power? And slowly with time, it has been given more and more power. And now it can introduce laws just like the Commission and the Council can. So it's a very slow process. I don't think looking at the EU is not necessarily the model that we should follow. It's not a great model of success. In a lot of ways, it's completely failed. But in that respect, it can show how something that was not very democratic became more democratic over time because people identified with it. And that is basically how it could work, in my opinion.
Yeah, and when you combine the force from the citizens' petitions and the agitation from the network of parliamentarians, and let's say the advocacy from the group of friends, I think that the vision can actually come true. And can you mention more about the role of the civil society in creating the UNPA?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I really hope the vision can come true. You know, I do believe in these ideas. I understand that they're very, very hard to achieve. I've had an older friend of mine. He was near 80 years old, and he took me outside. When I was telling him what I believed, he took me outside. We were on a boat on the water, and he told me that I was trying to move the wind and the waves. Basically, I'm trying to be God, and it's impossible to do what I want. So I do understand how difficult this is, which is why we do need such a strong coalition of civil society. And so the We the People's Campaign is a great example of that. Another one would be the Coalition for the International Criminal Court, or the Coalition for the United Nations We Need, C4UN. Those are all really nice coalitions of civil society, of NGOs around the world that all support, global governance reform in different ways. So basically getting NGOs to become aware of this issue, this global democratic deficit, and the fact that we need to transform global governance to solve any global issue, that's really key. And so, for example, let's take like the climate and biodiversity crises that we're facing right now. There are so many NGOs that focus on the climate, and they do really good work. They plant trees and so on and so forth. They do really good work for the climate and environmental protection and all these things. But they might not necessarily connect their issue with global governance reform. They may not see how the UN or even the International Criminal Court is at the same time helping, but also slowing down the work, and especially the veto power of the Security Council. We're not able to pass a global carbon tax because of the Security Council or because of the veto power. And we're not able to make ecocide a crime on the International Criminal Court because of national sovereignty, because of the power the national sovereignty has within the criminal court. So basically, if we can connect these environmental global governance issues and we can show them to other NGOs that work in that field, maybe they'll realize, oh, wow, reforming global governance is really the thing, or it's one thing that will make my job a whole lot easier in protecting the environment and climate and the biodiversity. So that's just one example. I mean, obviously, I can give that whole example with human rights or war and peace. At many different, pretty much any issue. If you look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, I mean, those are a bunch of different issues, and there's so many NGOs all working towards them. But we don't really achieve the Sustainable Development Goals because nation states are not required to do anything about them. They're just sort of guidelines. So yeah, I think that's, to answer your question, it's basically form big coalitions and show NGOs that global governance reform is important for their cause.
So coalition of NGOs.
Yeah, I mean, you don't necessarily, we don't necessarily have to start any new ones. Like I said, there's a lot of them, like the We the Peoples, C4UN, CICC, the ones I named. Those are great. So we don't have to sit here and develop our own. It's more showing these existing ones to NGOs and say, hey, you should be a part of this.
Okay. So we need to because NGOs are very issue driven. Each NGO has its own focus. They do not work for they don't work towards general goals. They work for specific objectives. So how do you align all these diverging goals to achieve one umbrella objective?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's the task of the movement. It's really the task of the World Federalist movement to get this done, and so it's a task of all of us. It's a good question because it takes a lot of people to find the right answer. Yeah, so basically, like what I was saying before, or what I can say is, unfortunately, so many issues have become globalized, and we see that more and more as time goes on, but we do live in an era of multiple overlapping global crises. And so what was once an environmental issue in this country or that country has now become the global climate issue. And we're actually pushing the planetary boundaries of Earth itself, which is a scientific term, which basically means that once we cross these red lines, we basically just lost the planet. It's a point of no return. So there are boundaries with which some scientists have decided or discovered, and we are reaching our boundaries. And once we cross these points, the Earth itself will no longer be a viable life giver, I guess, place for humanity to live. So that's the environmental side of things, but obviously that impacts everybody. You know, we're talking about the planet Earth itself. So no matter what issue you focus on, you need an Earth. So that's a great point to really draw focus to, attention, basically. But also, not only is the climate the only global issue. I mean, human rights abuses are unfortunately in every single country around the world. So somehow showing these, maybe a human rights organization in Sweden and in Rwanda, that actually they have a lot in common, because human rights abuses are unfortunately quite similar. Obviously in different contexts, but you know, when you get your rights abused, it's the same thing for everybody. So how do we show that human rights are a global right that we all should enjoy, and that human rights abuses is a global crime that we all need to be concerned about? So basically, with the famous Martin Luther King Jr. quote that, you know, an injustice anywhere is an injustice everywhere. So this is connected to world citizenship and solidarity with humans around the world and with humanity as a whole. And so, yeah, that's really important. So you have so many NGOs that are focused on just one area or region, but having the focus on having solidarity with peoples around the world is really important. So connecting the people that they care about. Maybe they're an NGO and they work in this city or in this town, but showing them that there's people all around the world just like them. So really globalizing issues, I think, is really what I'm saying here. We need to globalize issues, not only for NGOs, but for people around the world.
Okay. Now, I want to ask about the ideas that are going to drive this federation movement. We know that human beings are motivated by two factors primarily. One is pleasure, and another one is pain. You want to increase pleasure and you want to reduce pain. And I think in terms of political ideologies, there are two broad schools. There's idealism, where you motivate people by showing them what the world can be, and there's also realism, by showing them what they need to fear, and that fear drives them to band together and to do so many other things to reduce the threat that is in the external environment. So when we are creating these ideologies to drive the federalization movement, how can we engage both sides? How can we include both motivations in our messaging?
Well, I think we definitely have the idealism down. I think we've done a great job of being utopian and having a lot of different ideals. With that, I mean, I don't even think I need to go over it so much. It's pretty obvious. You know, we want a world where everyone has a say in global affairs. There's a global democracy. The climate is protected. There's basically a war is abolished, and ideally we're combining the power of humanity much more than we are now, with encouraging freedom of movement across borders and the ability to work and live in many different countries. That amount of free flow of exchange of ideas would, I believe, really liberate humanities from these boundaries of nation states, and create a really progressive future. So I really believe that and this is me personally talking here, but I really believe that the boundaries of nation states are really holding back the species as a whole. So that's sort of my utopian vision, and alongside that, a massive redistribution of the wealth, taxing the billionaires and the multinational corporations and redistributing the wealth to the people that need it around the world. And you can connect that even to reparations from the colonizing countries and imperialistic countries of the past, paying them to basically the victims of their colonial and imperial exploits. So those are my sort of personal utopian visions, basically. But how do you convince a realist that those are good or possible? Unfortunately, when it comes to the realism, the World Federalist ideology is quite lacking. But I think that we can point to some recent events in world affairs, particularly the war in Ukraine, that has shown that it does actually increase focus on international law, at least, and on the role of international justice institutions like the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice in The Hague. So as a realist, you might say, oh, well, look, there's now a war, and now suddenly the United States and other Western countries, or its friends basically, are now focused on making the International Criminal Court stronger to prevent these wars of aggression. So it's only because of a war of aggression, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that we get this push forward in terms of global governance. And really, the United States Congress is talking a lot more about the role of the International Criminal Court, when previously, for the last 20 years, they hate the court. They've never said anything nice about it, but now suddenly it's an important institution because of a war. And alongside that, you have European countries now, banning oil and gas from Russia and moving towards electrification, electrifying all of the vehicles and things like that, electrifying their grid and things like that. So there's been environmentalists calling for, this energy transition for decades, but it's only because of a war that we actually get this progress that we're looking for. So as a realist, you can sort of see that the idealism doesn't necessarily work as well as this real pressure, this realpolitik on the countries. So how would we create this? How would we create this real pressure on countries to act? And how do we show a realist that there's tangible material benefits to forming a world federation? Because that's really what you need to focus on when talking about realism, is more material benefits, either security or economic prosperity, money. And so you can say that in a world federation, it would be a peaceful world, because war between countries of the world would be very similar to war between states within the United States, like Nebraska going to war with Ohio, which is just unthinkable, or even Bundesländer here in Germany, Bavaria fighting Baden-Württemberg, like that would just never ever happen. So that's how we can basically, by using the federal model, we can make war basically unthinkable, because disputes are settled in court and with other dispute settlement mechanisms. So you can build global peace, which is therefore good for the economy. And then sort of what I was saying before with the freedom of movement, there's been a lot of really nice studies by economists that have shown that if there was global freedom of movement, yes, there would be a lot of crazy amounts of migration in the early years, but it would actually settle down because most people want to stay home. But the economic benefits would be incredible, because you could basically take a job anywhere in the world super easily. So the labor market would be extremely liberated, which isn't necessarily always a good thing. We need to be conscious of exploitation of labor. But economists have shown that with freedom of movement around the world, the economy would grow by about 200 times. And that's an economic benefit. That's an economic argument. I don't really make those arguments too much, but you asked me what the material or what the realist arguments for this are. So I would say that. Yeah.
Oh, okay. And there's also concern that the United Nations has been used as a tool by powerful countries to pursue their national interest. How can you assuage a weak country, let's say a country in Latin America or in Africa, that when they yield their sovereignty to this world government, it will not be dominated by big powerful countries who will use it as a tool to dominate them?
Yeah, that's obviously a very important question. And I think, to be honest, one of my personal core goals of a world federation. So for a long time, I mean, and we do have the power asymmetry to this day, but it's a very, very real fear, very understandable fear that many countries might have. I think it's important to focus that the attention on the multinational corporations that we have on Earth right now. So massive corporations like Nestle and Coca-Cola and so on and so forth. There's a whole lot of them. And they basically have, more money than many countries and more lawyers than many countries, and they can basically push around small national governments and get what they want. And that's usually resource extraction. So I think it's important to remember and to focus, to not lose sight of the fact that many small or poor countries, or many different ways to phrase it, underdeveloped countries, developing countries, they are basically exploited by multinational corporations and taken advantage of today. So that's the situation we're currently living in. So I see a world federation as a way to curb that by taxing these multinational corporations and enforcing standards on them, labor standards, dispute settlement standards, and things like that, and preventing them from extracting so many resources from poor developing countries and just selling products to people in rich countries with those resources. Preventing that supply chain of exploitation is key. In terms of like the legal and like the structure and the organization of a world federation, like what mechanisms could we use, or what instruments could we use to prevent one country from sort of stepping all over another? Well, it's key to have that representative body, that world parliament, which ideally wouldn't let anything like that happen, if you know what I mean. Like, if the people of the world as a whole are represented and have the most power when it comes to global governance, then basically when one country does something bad to another, then you would have all of humanity saying, no, you can't do that, and imposing, sanctions and punishments on that country. So it'd be a simple mechanisms of justice at that point. How do we enforce laws today? Well, there's many different ways to do it. So that's basically how I see that happening. And that's just the legislative body. Then you could have a world court, in which countries could bring each other to court, very similar to the International Criminal Court and the ICJ. But these rulings from a world court would be enforceable. So if the world court finds that this country is violating the law, well, then they would be punished, and they would have to respect those punishments. So that's basically how you could enforce the will of humanity, the voice of humanity, which is world law, onto a nation state, and prevent them from oppressing or exploiting another. And then to keep going, because I get this question a lot, so I actually have there's a few different instruments we could use. Then you can have an ombudsman, like the European Union also has an ombudsman, which is like an independent auditor, which basically anybody in the EU or any member state of the EU can give send a request to the ombudsman to review it and determine if an action by anybody or any institution in the European Union is against the European Charter of Human Rights, and then they can actually enforce sanctions on that, either on that individual or on that entity. Usually it's on member states. So basically, if a member state of the EU does something bad to a citizen, well, then that citizen can go to the ombudsman, and then they can sanction the member state. But they also have the Court of Human Rights as well. So there's multiple institutions actually responsible for protecting the rights of the individual and of member states. So I don't think there's any one silver bullet here. When it comes to making sure that we, abolish war and human rights abuses, we need to have many mechanisms in place to carry this out. It can't just be one thing. We need redundancy. Just like an airplane. Airplanes have multiple parts that do the same thing, because if one of them breaks, then you have another one to back it up. And this is exactly what we need. We need a lot of redundancy when it comes to protecting human rights.
Perfect. And thank you for addressing the concern, the political and economic concern of exploitation and domination. I think your response was very good. That third world countries or weak countries have a lot to fear from multinational corporations who have more resources and more power, bargaining and leverage to enforce to actually make sure that their interests are met in these different countries, and our government can help tax, regulate them, and to prevent domination and exploitation of national states. And a legislative body which is representative is going to actually look out for the interest of these small and weak states. And a court that has enforceable rulings is going to be a magistrate to ensure that there is global justice. An ombudsman is going to be a referee to make sure that the playing field is equal, that any state or any multinational corporation that violates human rights, for example, is actually brought to book. So those are political and economic concerns. So what about the cultural aspect? For example, the United States of America, the federation model worked primarily because Americans have a common language, English, and they share a common culture. But in other federations, for example, in Canada, the issue of language is a big barrier. French and English-speaking territories do not really agree. There's, for example, India, where Muslims and Hindus are actually engaging in war, and in Nigeria, where the north has states that are mostly dominated by Muslims, trying to conquer the southern states that are Christian dominated. How can a world federation work in the absence of a common language and a common global culture?
Yeah. Ooh, it's a really big question. Again, this point is often debated by World Federalists over, yeah, what's almost more important, the political, economic, or social, cultural side. I've met a few World Federalists that say, we shouldn't even be talking about political and economic integration before we have, a global culture. That's the first step to any of this. So I don't know if I agree with that. I think we can do things before that, but yeah, it's a very they have a really good argument for a reason. It's the reasons that you pointed out exactly, that there's so much diversity basically on Earth. How are we all going to come together? And I personally can't even begin to answer that question fully. It's another one of those big questions that we need many people to sit down and decide together how we should integrate so many different cultures, and protection of minority cultures and minority languages and things like that. And it's very important. These things need to be handled very delicately and with a lot of respect for everybody. So overall, I would say that we are slowly watching the establishment of a global culture in some respects. It obviously, these things take a long time. Languages change over hundreds of years, not in hours. So this takes a long time. But I think because of the internet, I do think that the foundations, at least, for a global culture are being laid, because of basically the exchange of information is so rapid. The ability to talk to each other is just so easy now, and not for everybody. There is a massive digital divide. I do recognize that, but I mean just the first steps. We're crawling, and ideally one day we'll be able to walk and run as a united human culture. I think the language thing is a little bit less important, but there are also many, cosmopolitans and globalists and world federalists that think that a common language is, again, the first step. And so you have the Esperanto movement that's really old, and they believe we need a common language to unite peoples. And then you have the Globasa movement, which is another constructed language. So there are many people that believe that language is really the answer here. It's a tricky question. It's a really tricky question. I would point out that there are many cultures and nations really that don't really fit into the current system of 193 nation states. You can look up the international organization. It's called the UNPO, the Unrecognized Nations and Peoples Organization. So it's sort of an international organization for these peoples that are not represented in their own nation. You brought up a pretty good one with the Quebecois. A lot of them believe that they are not represented, which is the whole reason for that whole the dispute that you pointed out between the French-speaking and the English-speaking communities of Canada. But then you also have like the Catalonia in Spain. And then, oh man, there's a lot. I mean, East Timor was also one of these unrecognized nations and peoples, and now they're their own country. So there's a lot. I think Biafra in Nigeria, I don't want to say the wrong word, but there's another sort of a movement in Nigeria that wants to be their own country. And not all of these separatist movements are, necessarily great. I'm not saying that they are all really great and they're good people, but they do feel like they don't fit into the current nation state system, which does show you that this current system also doesn't really reflect the diversity of humanity correctly at all. There are many nations and people groups that don't fit into this 193. I mean, look at the Navajo Nation in the United States. I mean, they have a huge amount of land and people and a whole culture, and they're not really represented at all. Like, in the fair, I think they have an observer member in the United States Congress, for example, but they can't vote or anything like that. So they're just straight up not represented as a Navajo Nation. They might be represented as U.S. citizens, but not as a nation. So I think when we talk about a global democracy, each and every human being and every people group or nation would be represented in a global democracy equally and fairly. So many of these peoples that are currently left out of the current system would have a voice in the global democracy.
And one of the aspects of a global republic is the division of power between two levels of government. The central federal world state, world government, and 193 or so national states. So where do we find the balance between one extreme where the world government is too powerful and it overwhelms the member states, or the current situation where the national or the member states are too powerful to actually drive the central government becomes weak to actually intervene in internal matters of national governments. So what's the perfect balance?
Yeah, I wish I knew. I think that I mean, you've identified the two extremes. I definitely don't believe in any of the two extremes. I don't like the current system, and I don't think we should have a overpowerful global dictatorship that just pushes everybody around. There does need to be a balance. I would look to other federations for examples. There's not one current nation state that has the perfect system that we can just take and apply it to the whole globe, but there are certain mechanisms or institutions that work really well in some countries, in some current federations, that we may want to apply or practice at the global level. Ultimately, I believe that this whole question of federalism and what the federation side should look like should be decided by the World Parliament, by the global democracy, and it should be an iterative process. It should never stop being decided. So, for example, here in Germany, since the Bundesrepublik Deutschland, since the Federal Republic of Germany was founded in 1949, they've had, I think, 5 or 6 what they call like federalism conferences, where the upper house of their parliament or of their legislative system and the lower house, so the Bundesrat and the Bundestag, they come together along with members of the Bundesländer parliament, so basically with the states. So you get like a whole conference of all the different representatives from all the different levels of government coming together. And they would answer a specific question about federalism, about, usually it has to do with an issue like finance or education. Can the Bundesländer, can the lower level of government, handle this much money or tax in this way? Like maybe a state wants to do a tax, and then they'd hold a conference and decide if that was okay. For example, the Berlin, where I live, is a Bundesländer. It's a state within Germany. And Berlin passed a law to have a ceiling, a rent ceiling. Basically, it said that the rents across the city could not be higher than what they were in 2015. So everybody's rent went down. But it basically caused a massive debate within the country over whether or not a state could do that, whether or not they had the power to pass such strong economic legislation. And it didn't cause one of these federalism conferences that I'm talking about. Those are really rare. There's only happened like 5 times. But it did go to the Constitutional Court here in Germany, and they decided. And actually, they decided to get rid of that. They said that Berlin did not have the power to do that, and that sort of law could only be decided at the national level. So then everybody's rents went up again, and it was really lame for me because I pay rent here in the city. But that just shows you an example of that this process continues. So I don't think, again, it's a very similar thing to what you said before about allocation of seats in the World Parliament, that, I can't really sit here and pretend to design the perfect system. I think what we really need to do is reflect on the system. Is it working? Be experimental, try new things, reflect on it. If it doesn't work, try something different. So I think if countries want to have power over this, okay, let them have power over that. We see it's not working. Maybe the power should go to the global level. And if that's not working, we need to find something new and be creative as well. What we see now is that nation states have power over everything, and it's not working. So that's why I'm a world federalist, because I believe at least some of this power should go to the global level.
Yeah, thank you for thank you for your response. And my final question for today will be, what, like, when you look at what's going on in the world, the recent political developments, what do you see that gives you an indication that a world state is actually emerging? What small things just show you that yeah, it's actually, yeah, there's hope? What gives you hope?
I mean, I don't want to be corny, but I really like what I do. I'm really, my favorite pathway to world federalism is definitely the grassroots movement side of things, and getting people all around the world to call for the change. Because even the UN reform, even charter reform, or the incremental UN stuff, or even regionalization, all of this takes a big movement of people. Like the European Union was called for decades by the European Federalists. So there's a huge movement of people behind this institution. It didn't just get created out of a vacuum. You know what I mean? Like there was people calling for this and protesting in the streets to stop war in Europe, and we need to forever. And that's why we have the EU. So that's what I really like. That's what I really like to see, is a movement of people growing. So to be honest, I love to see what you're doing in East Africa, and your desire to hold meetings and plan something for the Week for World Parliament, and everything that you're doing, and others just like you around the world, in India, and in the United States, and here in Germany, Japan. I mean, really, we're scattered. The Philippines, Indonesia. I mean, we have people everywhere. It's really great. And so I really think that these young people that are excited by these ideas, they are what give me hope, and they indicate to me that yes, this idea is possible, and it's happening.
Perfect. So let's conclude with an article I read today. I'm just going to read a small bit, and you'll give me your thoughts on it. Begins, the truth is, however, that despite let me begin from states as well as larger regional units that are committed to liberal democracy possess legitimacy, which implies no obligation to dissolve. In some places, one likes to declare that the nation state is outdated. The truth is, however, that despite its perversions, it became the worldwide dominant model because of its important accomplishments. For instance, religious and economic freedoms of individuals follow from its separation of state and society. Economy and material wealth were created by it, as well as modern administration, which in turn are hardly conceivable without the extent of social integration that we find in nation states. The renewal of the European education and science, the increase of the educational level of all citizens, and the establishment of a welfare state are also accomplishments rooted in the nation state. Furthermore, the state admits the thought that basic and human rights advances the sovereignty of the people and establishes a parliament. Moreover, it abolishes serfdom, feudal privileges, and legal inequality of women. Finally, the supplement, the civic society grows, sometimes in opposition to the established governmental institutions, first and foremost within states, and still helps this to fulfill many tasks and be at the same time more citizen-oriented and efficient. For reasons like that, philosophy gives the World Republic a subsidiary and complementary rank. And because of the so defined rank of the World Republic, philosophy is not dreaming a sweet dream that modifies the reality of the world according to its needs. The World Republic does not promise, anyway, the all-encompassing well-being which religions call salvation and rightly do not expect for this world. The World Republic that is called for is an ideal, and humanity is morally obliged to realize it. So what are your opinions and your thoughts regarding the article I just read?
I really liked it. I like it a lot. I love the obligation line that, yeah, it's our duty to do this. I really like it a lot. Where was that from, actually?
I read it in a journal. I can't remember the full name of the journal, but it's a philosophy journal.
Cool.
Yeah. So from my end, I think the article has pointed out some things that we can actually transfer from the state level to the global level, such as the separation of religion and government. Yeah, so that the world government will be secular, and it will not be dominated by any ideology that is going to marginalize any group. The second is the extent of being citizen oriented and efficient. The tasks of the task of the government, such as advancing basic and human rights, advancing the sovereignty of the people, having a parliament, abolishing serfdom, slavery, feudal privileges, giving women and men equal rights, and empowering the civil society. Those are some of the things that can be transferred from the state to the world government. And it also points out that the World Republic, it's going to be subsidiary to subsidiary and complementary to the state, that the state is still going to be a dominant factor in world politics, and the World Republic is going to come to complement it and to do what the national government cannot.
Yeah. Cool. That's really nice. It's a really nice text. It's cool, really cool that you found that. I like it a lot.
Yeah, I'll share the link in the chat and also in the notes for this podcast.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and thank you so much for your time. Do you have any concluding remarks before we go?
No. I thank you very much for your time. Thank you for the questions. It was a bit of a surprise with all the questions, but I'm always happy to talk about it. These are nice topics to discuss. So thank you very much.
Yeah, anytime, and you're welcome. I will have this next week and every week after that.
Cool. Nice. Wow. Really, that's great to hear. Nice.
So allow me to stop the recording.
Okay. Yeah. Stop recording.